Hey gang. Last time we talked about some notable failures to replicate in the psychological literature. Today we're going to talk about some of the features that may have sparked the replication crisis and about the ways the scientific community has responded. So this will take us from replication crisis to credibility revolution. We ended last time with the claim that failures to replicate may reflect the presence of false positives in the literature. If I come along and publish a study that doesn't agree with the true state of the world, and then you come along and try to replicate it, that finding won't replicate because it wasn't true to begin with. So in our next 3 class periods, we're going to tackle some of the factors that lead to false positives in the literature and talk about how to deal with them. So we're going to just start our discussion by addressing a concept that you read about, which is researcher degrees of freedom. When you hear or read this term, I would encourage you to mentally translate it to the choices that researchers make or the flexibility that researchers have. So to demonstrate this flexibility, let's walk through a really simple example. Let's say we want to test the efficacy of a new migraine drug. So we randomly assign half of our participants, who are all people who have migraines, to either take a drug intended to treat migraines or to take a sugar pill, a placebo. And at the end of the day, they fill out a survey about how their headaches were that day. So if they had pain, how severe the pain was, if they had to change their plans as a result of the pain, etc. So they get some little pop-up on their phone, they type in numbers to rate their pain. We also collect some demographic data from our participants because previous work has shown that different types of migraines respond differently to different types of drugs. So if we run this study for a couple of months and we find that the drug group has fewer symptoms than the placebo group, our drug works. So it seems like a relatively simple study, right? We have just one independent variable that can only have 2 different levels, either drug or placebo. But before we can answer the question, did the drug work? We have a bunch of choices to make. We have researcher degrees of freedom. So first, we have to decide whether our dependent variable should be the number of days with pain, the average pain ratings of all of the days, the average pain ratings of the days that they had headaches, maybe their self-reported improvement of pain, or maybe the number of days they had to change their plans due to their pain. Given that they answered all of those questions, we have all of those data. Then we have some other decisions to make. Like, it turns out some people didn't do the study for the whole 2 months. So what do we do with those people? Do we include the data that we had from them, or do we exclude them altogether? And either of those could conceivably make sense. The point is that it's a choice to make. Then, what do we do about gender? Maybe it's the case that different genders respond to this drug differently. So maybe we should break it up by gender. Maybe we should break it up by age group. Maybe it affects different ages differently. Maybe we should break it up by the severity of headaches that people have, or maybe by the cause of headaches. So all of these could be reasonable choices. Maybe we have some specific hypotheses about why the drug should affect certain people in certain ways. The point is not that any of these choices is bad, but just that there's a lot of them. In fact, using just the variables that I've described, this means that we could potentially analyze 192 different tests. We could run the data 192 different ways to answer the simple question, does this drug treat migraines? So this is what's referred to as the garden of forking paths. We want to ask one question, but there are lots of reasonable paths that we might take in order to do so. Now remember that a p-value of 0.05 means there's a 5% chance that we would have gotten a result this extreme or more extreme if in fact the null hypothesis were true, if in fact there were no difference between the groups. So if we were to do 192 tests, that means we could expect 10 significant false positives. If there were no statistically significant results, we would expect 10 significant false positives from this data set, just given the number of tests that we have run. So researchers may want to ask a simple question, does the drug help treat headaches? But they have lots of choices about how they're going to ask that question analytically. So a few different ways that people could potentially analyze the data, questions that people have to ask, are shown on the screen. And I want to draw your attention to one in particular, and that is about covariates. So in false positive psychology, you read about how choices about which covariates to include may affect outcomes. So you may have some main question of interest, but it may also be necessary to control for the influence of other variables as well. So that's where covariates come in. So covariates statistically control for the influence of variables that are not of primary interest. As an example, let's say you want to evaluate the relationship between how long someone has been awake and the likelihood of them throwing a temper tantrum. Now, using age as a covariate in this analysis will improve the relationship between wakefulness and tantrums. That is, will better enable you to draw inferences between hours of wakefulness and tantrums, because those two variables are strongly related for young kids, but they're not related for adults. You keep my kids awake for 12 hours, they're definitely going to have a tantrum. You keep me awake for 12 hours, likelihood is still pretty low. So including age as a covariate can, in some cases, help control for other kind of nuisance variables in your data. So including covariates is a totally reasonable thing to do in a lot of data analyses. The point is just that it's another choice that researchers get to make. So, how can researcher degrees of freedom lead to false positives? Well, one answer is that given all of the choices we get to make, if scientists try lots and lots of different analyses, which we can because we have choices, and then only report the analyses that worked, that is, that showed statistically significant results, we have a literature based on spurious results that just happened by chance. We have all of these 192 options, and let's say if we run all of those analyses and then only choose to report this one, that happened to show a statistically significant result, we have engaged in what is referred to as p-hacking. So p-hacking, p like the p for statistical significance, hacking like, hacking, is trying lots of analyses until you find something that renders a statistically significant outcome. And then generally only reporting that one analysis, but not that you in fact tried lots and lots of other analyses that didn't render statistically significant results. Now, the danger of p-hacking is that every test you run increases the likelihood that you'll end up getting a statistically significant result just by chance. Try enough tests and something will be significant. That doesn't mean it actually reflects the true state of the world. It means it could have emerged simply by a statistical anomaly, simply by chance. I showed this last time, and I made the claim that non-significant studies don't make it into the literature, right? That all of those ones shown in pink are just sitting in some scientist's file drawer and never got published. But in fact, it may be worse than this. It may be that those non-significant findings are not missing from the literature. It may be that they are in the literature and they are masquerading as statistically significant findings. That is, they may have been tortured into significance and are now false positives sitting in the literature looking a lot like true positives. Another practice that can lead to false positives in the literature is a practice called harking, or hypothesizing after results are known. Rather than testing a hypothesis, we look at the data and then pretend we had that hypothesis all along. So let's say that we ran our migraine study and we found that the drug helped, but of the 192 analyses that we ran, we found that it only helped for women who had high levels of stress to begin with and were over 50. Now, it could be that the drug actually does help only that group, right? Maybe it's a very specific drug that actually helps that group. It could also be that we ran dozens and dozens of tests, and that one was the only one that came up as statistically significant, and it did so just by chance. Now, if we say that we predicted that, we're treating what may have been a spurious result that happened as a function of severe data torture as one that we had expected all along. My favorite harking metaphor is that Babe Ruth's home run wouldn't have been so impressive if he had pointed to the outfield and called his shot after hitting the ball, right? Calling our shots ahead of time is what makes finding evidence for them more compelling. So the concern here is that the scientific process may have been proceeding kind of like this. We find a bunch of random stuff and then we pretend that that's what we were aiming for all along. So the guide to getting publishable results might, alarmingly, look like this. Did you get the effect that you predicted? Yay! Awesome. You get to publish. No, you didn't get the effect. Okay. Did you find anything? Is there anything statistically significant? Yes? Awesome. You get to publish. That's great. Just hark your way into it. Okay, did you get an effect? No, you didn't get any effect. Are you sure? Can you kind of dig around and find something in there? Yes? Wonderful. P-hack. You just P-hacked your way into a publication. Okay, so I'm presenting these practices of p-hacking and harking as though it happens by sneaky, malicious scientists plotting to fill the literature with false positives. But in fact, I think the majority of this happens relatively innocently and often unintentionally or unconsciously. We'll talk more in class about why and how these kinds of questionable research practices may emerge. But in any case, it appears that various forms of p-hacking and harking are common practices in science. Students see other people engaging in these practices and assume that it's the way that science is supposed to be done, so they engage in them as well. In a follow-up paper to the one you read, False Positive Psychology, Joseph Simmons and his colleagues said of these questionable research practices, everyone knew it was wrong, but they thought it was wrong the way it's wrong to jaywalk. Simulations revealed that it's wrong the way it is wrong to rob a bank. I love this quote because it helps to kind of humanize and explain the fact that researchers may have realized that the practices that they were engaging in weren't ideal, but they didn't understand the potential ramifications of those behaviors. So, our interim summary is, scientists have at our disposal a number of methods for influencing whether or not we get statistically significant results that are often really hard to detect. Point 2 is that getting statistically significant results increases the chances that we'll be able to publish our findings. And 3, scientists are incentivized to publish. We'll talk more about exactly why that is in our class discussion. So what this leads to is a recipe for a literature full of false positives. We can take our ugly, non-significant findings and mold them into flashy and significant results. And of course, those things shouldn't be expected to replicate because they weren't true to begin with. So the question is, what do we do now? If we left things here, it would look pretty grim. Don't turn it off now. Please keep watching. Okay, what do we do? Science is often described as being self-correcting. As researcher James Heathers points out, though, that self-correcting doesn't happen by a magical process. It happens because we correct it. So the narrative about the replication crisis was focused at first on all of the problems in science, but has now shifted to also including solutions. How do we fix these issues that are plaguing science and potentially leading to the presence of lots of false positives? So that means that we have gone from replication crisis to credibility revolution. And the responses that researchers have made are exciting and inspiring and clever. One of the major advocates for these reforms, and in fact, the person who coined the term credibility revolution, is Samin Vazire. She helped to found the Society for the Improvement of Psychological Science, which is the professional organization that's been the most vocal in advocating for these kinds of open science policies we'll be digging into next. And she's a Carl, class of 2000. Okay, so how can we deal with the presence of false positives in the literature and reduce the likelihood that new studies that are published are in fact false positives? So many of the solutions have to do with increasing transparency. People can't evaluate what you did if they don't know what you did. So transparency is really one of the cornerstones of science. People have to know what we did in order to be able to evaluate it. So one of the ways that we can increase transparency, one of the earliest proposed solutions to these problems, is what's called the 21-word solution. It states that researchers should be expected to affirm, when publishing a paper, that they are reporting everything transparently. They didn't just collect data until they got a significant p-value. They didn't kick participants out in order to get significant results, and so forth. Now, although this doesn't prevent outright fraud, right? People could just lie and say they didn't exclude participants. It means that people have to at least affirm that they did things without those questionable research practices. And it draws attention to the fact that not doing these things may lead to problems. Proponents of the 21-word solution made a parallel with nutritional labels, right? You have to tell people what's in their food. You should also have to tell them what's in your paper, how you did your science. What's really nice about the 21-word solution is that it's free, it's easy to implement, it's a low-stakes thing for journals to require researchers to include, so it's a very easy initiative to implement. Another solution for increasing transparency is what's called pre-registration. This is intended to increase transparency in about the predictions that researchers have and in how they analyzed their data. So when I do a pre-registration, I write up my hypotheses, the methods I'm planning to use, how many participants I'll run, the circumstances under which I'll exclude participants, the analyses, all of that before I've collected any data. So I make a plan, a written plan, before I collect any data. I then submit that written plan to a website called the Open Science Framework that creates a time-stamped, uneditable version of my plan. Then I run along, I conduct my study, I follow my pre-registered plan, and then when I submit my manuscript to a journal, I include that timestamp document that enables me to say, look, before I saw the data, I made all of the calls about everything that I was going to do. I had this plan before I saw the data. Then, when the paper is eventually published, you include text pointing to the pre-registration so that your readers, for the rest of their time anyone's ever looking at your paper, can also look back and confirm that you did exactly what you said you would do ahead of time. So the benefits of pre-registration are that it limits the number of choices you can make after you've seen the data. You have to call your shots and specify which of those researcher degrees of freedom you're actually going to use and how you're going to conduct the study ahead of time. It also limits p-hacking because you're saying your analyses up front. And it reduces harking because you actually have to specify your hypotheses before you see the data. So the practice of pre-registration has absolutely exploded in the last few years and is increasingly becoming common throughout the sciences. In fact, the authors of False Positive Psychology argue that we must embrace disclosure and pre-registration as if the credibility of our profession depended on it. Because it does. Isn't that a great line? But even though the 21-word solution and pre-registration greatly improve transparency, it's important to remember that transparency in the form of pre-registration or any other form doesn't necessarily mean good science. It's not an indicator of quality. You could pre-register a really poorly designed study. You could transparently report terrible analytical decisions. Just because it's transparent doesn't mean it's good. But transparency is necessary for others to evaluate the quality of the work. You can't know if the research was done well if you don't know how the research was done. Another new open science practice intended to combat fickle results that may depend on specific analytic choices is called a multiverse analysis. Other similar concepts are specificity analyses or sensitivity analyses. The idea with these is that rather than pre-registering one specific analysis plan, you conduct lots and lots of analyses, maybe even every possible reasonable analysis that you could analyze the data, and then assess whether your results depend on the specific analyses that you chose. So if you pre-register one specific set of analyses and you happen to just get lucky and that is statistically significant, but every other way you analyze the data may not have been statistically significant, that should be concerning as well, right? Getting one lucky shot in amongst a field of unlucky findings isn't something that we want to aim for either. So, for example, let's say we want to know whether birth order affects life outcomes. So are us babies of the family, us secondborns, is it really true that we're better looking and kinder and better in every way? Well, a group of researchers collected data on thousands of people and asked about birth order, like firstborn, secondborn. They also collected data on a number of potential outcome variables like life satisfaction and intellect and positive reciprocity, among others. Positive reciprocity is measured by responses to things like, if someone does me a favor, I am willing to return it. And people say, does this apply to me? Yes or no? Okay, so the researchers collect all this data and then they run the analyses using all of these different approaches. So they have lots of different ways that they could analyze the data set, different covariates they could include, different combinations of factors that might lead to the outcome variables, and so forth. These are all decisions that would be kind of reasonable to make, that people could, that researchers studying this might reasonably choose. So they conduct all of these analyses and then they look at the patterns that each of those analyses render. So let's look at the results for the positive reciprocity data. Here's what they found. Okay, so this shows the effect of being a later born child for each of the different model specifications. So the specifications down at the bottom are just the different analyses that they ran. Black lines represent models that did not find a statistically significant effect of birth order on positive reciprocity scores. The red lines showed the models that did find a statistically significant effect. So some of these models showed that firstborns have greater positive reciprocity, and some showed that secondborns have greater positive reciprocity. But the vast majority, about 90% of the models, did not find any statistically significant effects. That is, they had p-values larger than 0.05. So if a researcher had these data and wanted to p-hack, they could absolutely find evidence consistent with the claim that firstborns have more positive reciprocity, or that they have less. If a well-meaning researcher happened to pre-register one of those red statistically significant analyses, they would have gotten lucky and found evidence consistent with their claim, even though the majority of evidence isn't consistent with that claim. So these more kinds of global analyses let us see the frequency with which those analyses could occur, with the frequency with which researchers could find those patterns of results. Okay, so everything that I've talked to so far, like multiverse analyses, pre-registration, the 21-word solution, are things that researchers can implement individually, right? These are practices we can all do on our own in our labs. But there are also proposed solutions intended to improve the quality of research and combat publication bias that happen at the level of the journal. In traditional scientific publishing, researchers plan a study, they can pre-register it if they want, they conduct it and analyze the data and go through the process of peer review before that study is accepted. Note that this pre-registration step doesn't guarantee publication. As I said, you can pre-register a terrible study and a journal may decide wisely not to publish it because it's a terrible study. But there's a new publishing format called a registered report that existing journals are beginning to adopt. And in registered reports, the journal reviews and makes decisions about acceptance prior to data collection. So we take the traditional publishing method and we switch around some of the key steps. So researchers make a detailed plan of exactly what they're going to do by writing an introduction, a hypothesis, and a method section, and an analysis plan, and then submitting that to the journal before they've run the study. So they submit it with no data. It then goes through normal rounds of peer review, and if the reviewers and the editors approve, if they like it, the paper is accepted in principle, meaning that the journal agrees to publish it no matter what the outcome is. If it is an interesting question to ask, it's interesting no matter whether the results support the hypothesis or not. So in addition to dealing with many of the issues that pre-registration helps with, registered reports also help negate publication bias. So the study is accepted whether the results are statistically significant or not, thereby keeping non-significant results out of the file drawer. The figure that's shown represents a recent analysis comparing registered reports with traditional academic publishing. And it found that registered reports are far more likely to find results that do not support the hypotheses. So on the left is the 96% positivity rate of traditionally published papers, right? Most papers find statistically significant evidence in support of the hypothesis. For registered reports, only 44% found support for their hypotheses. Here's what that means. If we remove statistical significance as a prerequisite for getting published, studies become much less likely to render statistically significant results.
What?
That's a really big deal, right? Especially because the designs of registered reports are peer-reviewed prior to data collection, which means they are likely to be stronger designs than those in traditional publishing. The sample sizes are typically bigger in registered reports than in traditional publishing, and the hypotheses and the analyses are locked in ahead of time. Therefore, this suggests a tremendous amount of publication bias at best and p-hacking at worst. Another open science practice that has gained traction recently is scientific sharing.
Aww.
After researchers conduct their study, typically they keep all of their data and code and the stimuli that they used to run the study safe in their file drawers. Sometimes if you ask people for it, they'll share it with you after the fact. But in general, it's really hard to get access to the raw materials of the science, either for evaluation or for reuse. But in recent years, more and more people have started sharing all of their data and code on the Open Science Framework to have them be freely available for anyone to look at. Here's the raw data, here's how we did the analyses, here's what we found. In addition, people are more and more often sharing their stimulus materials. So if you run a study like my lab does on speech perception, that includes a lot of files of people talking. So I can share those files of people talking with anybody else who wants to do similar kinds of studies. So this makes it easier for other people to conduct direct replications, to ask questions of the same data set, and it also makes it easier for other people to identify errors in what you have done. So in class, we'll talk about some of the other advantages to sharing and reasons that people may be resistant to do so. So here's where we are so far. It's clear that shoddy practices and misplaced incentives have sullied the scientific record, and psychology and other disciplines need to make some serious reforms, which is exactly the direction that the field seems to be heading. This is an exciting time to be a psychologist because the field is changing rapidly and in fascinating ways. Organizations like the Center for Open Science are coming up with ways that people can pre-register and more transparently share their materials. Organizations like the Society for the Improvement of Psychological Science are coming up with initiatives and methods for teaching and improving open science. Organizations like the Psych Science Accelerator and CRAPE are finding ways that multiple labs can work together to get huge samples and replicate prior work. Some journals are committed to evaluating papers based on methods rather than on whether the papers got statistically significant results. And the next generation of scientists and consumers of science are getting trained up right now in how we can make science more transparent and robust. Change is happening and you are part of it. Remember to post comments on Slack, and in class we'll talk about the incentive structure of science, what objections people have to implementing open science practices, and how we can motivate people to adopt these practices. I will see you in class.